Welcome everyone to our 14th session of our study of the Gospel of Mark. This is the third to the last session. Although I was thinking about maybe adding in a bonus section because in years past, I've just not covered the material that appears after chapter 16, verse 8, because it's from, a century or so or more later, but it might be worth looking at and sort of seeing if we can determine, why it is that the church decided they wanted to add that there. And then given that we've just studied and seen so, richly how Mark incorporates and utilizes all his characters and images and symbols, how it's so starkly different. Maybe that would be good. So I may add an extra class. So just keep showing up. I guess it's all it amounts to. But look, I know last week we covered chapter 13, and that was a tougher section, a tougher chapter, and it was intended to be. The apocalyptic discourse is really a time of warning, and ultimately Jesus is using those stark stories, and Mark is using those stark stories to remind us to stay watchful, to stay vigilant, and to implore those who are good soil to continue to be so as things get tough. Because as we've seen from the beginning, when we went through the parable of the sower, there's that quality of soil that we've seen a bunch of characters embody that sort of starts off real good, but then when the going gets tough, when the persecutions happen, they wither and they fall away. And he's imploring them not to do that. So that stark chapter, last chapter, really is meant to be more encouraging, that while it's scary, while it's hard, it's still, it's not just, hang in there, because you're gonna, by giving your life for that purpose, you will save it. That's what Jesus is imploring people, that idea of don't hold on to your fear, don't hold on to your protectionism, that sort of thing. So he's imploring that. And now we get to this section here, chapter 14, or at least we're doing the bulk of chapter 14, because the stuff happens so fast and it's such a dense portion that we're covering. There's a lot to talk about today, but things really happen in this rapid fire succession where we start to see in this definite kind of, a very limited sense of time here, we start to see all of these things that we've been hearing about from the beginning, right? When we first were introduced to Judas, we knew that he would be the one to betray Jesus. Now the betrayal is about to happen. We're going to see the events of the disciples' flight, and we're certainly Peter's denial will be imminent, although that's going to happen next session. So we're seeing those three particular events: betrayal, flight, and then denial. We're seeing those really take shape and how that's happening. And what's really cool about this, when you look at it from a narrative perspective, there's sort of four episodes, four events that kind of shape the way the story is told. And there's this rising crescendo of intensity, okay? And it happens through, this series of, it's like dialogue and then monologue, dialogue, monologue. And then there's also confrontation and command, confrontation often by the disciples with Jesus, and then Jesus makes some sort of command. So it's this tension that's being built, and it kind of bounces back and forth from the point. It sort of begins, I would say, with greatest intensity with that section during the Last Supper, what we call the Last Supper, when he says, I'm sitting with my betrayer, and they ask that fateful question, is it I? Is it I? And they go from that to Jesus then saying, take this bread. And it's this intense moment where we've seen their inability to take the bread, to take what he's really giving them. So will they take the bread this time? And that sort of thing. There's that tension. And then it goes to the next scene where he's talking about the betrayal and those who will desert him. And Peter says, I will not. And it's this, oh my gosh, it's so, because you're rooting for them, and yet we all know where they've been in the past. And so we know that to say that, is they going to be able to follow through? So they say, I will not. All of them do. All of them say that, not just Peter. And then at the last in the garden, Jesus says, as he said in chapter 13, he says to them, remain here and what? Watch. Stay awake. It's the exact same command. It's what he asked them to do in chapter 13. He says it to the disciples, and we get to see how that plays out. But it's this rising sort of interlocking tension it's just so wonderful. So when we read it out loud, just watch what Mark weaves with the way he tells this story. And then the only other thing I wanted to say is that we will get to see the last representation of good soil, of explicit and definitive good soil in the gospel with that woman who anoints Jesus' feet. Okay, that is the last example. And we'll talk about what that represents and why and all that stuff. So there's a lot here. And anyway, we'll get to it. I'm excited. So any comments or questions about the reading for today or about last week for that matter? I'll start with Carol and then we'll go to Bonnie.
I noticed in verse 51, I had never noticed that little paragraph about the man who ran away and his cloak came off and he ran away naked.
Yes.
Are we going to touch on that? Because
yes. Yeah. Well, and there's been a lot of speculation as to what that man represents. And I have, where I'm going to go today is something that a lot of scholars have come to more of a consensus about. I don't know if consensus is the right word because it is fairly mysterious, but I do want to say there was a really cool book written by a man named Morton Smith called The Secret Gospel of Mark that I will say to me, in the end, it's far-fetched, but it's really interesting because it plays on this idea that naked man was some sort of secret reference to a message that insiders were supposed to understand, and again, it's esoteric to us. We don't understand it. But to me, to do that at this juncture is so different than the way the whole gospel has worked, where it really hasn't been trying to separate, between the insiders and who have the secret message. Yeah, it talks about how the disciples should have been the insiders, the so-called insiders, but they were never set up to be exclusive that way. The message has been for all. So that to me is one of the biggest rubs for this sort of secret, there's something very mysterious about that young man. But I think there's a much more sort of sensible or just sort of reasonable or there's another way of looking at this that I think is still really meaningful, and it illustrates some very specific points that Mark is trying to get across. So we will get to that, but also pay attention to the young man, if he makes another appearance later in the gospel, we'll get to see that too. Okay, but that is one, and it's great. I love how that happens. Right. I mean, we've read this gospel our entire lives, and then we get to it one more time. And then because we're studying it with different sets of eyes and, it's like, whoa, where'd that come from? I never noticed that before. So excellent. Bonnie?
Well, my question or my thoughts were about the prayer in the garden. You have mentioned recently about God didn't send his son to die. And yet when Jesus prays, he prays, if it's your will, let this cup pass. Well, the cup didn't pass.
Right.
So people could say, well, then it's God's will that he died. And that's why in John 3:16, he sent his only son. So I'm still kind of struggling with that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I get the whole God's will, he isn't the puppeteer and we're not the puppets, and every movie makes it. Everything that happens is either God's will or not. I get that part of it. But the part about Christ dying, when I go to that verse, it still kind of sounds like, well, yeah, he did want him to die.
Yeah, and I can see where you can go down that path, because again, a lot of us have been taught that the whole meaning, the whole lead up to Jesus getting to that place in the garden was that this was sort of something that was necessary to happen, divinely necessary, this required sacrifice by the Son. But remember all the things that have led to that point, and none of them were initiated by God to have happen. It was because of the particular soil of evil that met Jesus, that received him. It was all those other things that created this. Okay, so leading him to that place in the garden was not God. It wasn't that God caused all those machinations to happen. It was humanity that caused that, evil within humanity that caused that. And so Jesus, in his own expression of deep humanity, is asking, may this cup be lifted, be removed from me. And that's where he's, and then he realizes, as soon as he says it, because it's almost like an interior battle that he's facing here. And we'll talk about what that represents and why it's expressed this way, because it's very rich meaning. So to me, to ask God to maybe intervene there is more of a human aspect within Jesus that he's grappling with, but it doesn't reflect all of those things that happened that led Jesus to that place, of which God wasn't a part. God wasn't causing any of this to happen. Is that clearer?
Yeah, it kind of, I guess the only thing I could relate it to is if we have a loved one that is in the hospital, is sick, somebody that is dying, and you say, oh, if it's your will, let them live, and then they don't live. So that was God's will for them to die and not live. It's kind of the same thing in a way.
I'm not so sure. I don't know that he's saying, take this cup from me. I
No.
think more, to me, it's a different thing. And we have to be really careful about those kind of expressions, to my mind, to say, hey, if it's your will, that may they live. If it's your will, may they die. It's like, okay, that is again, that example is just pushing it a little further. And to me, when Jesus is in the garden and praying, may this cup be removed from me, it is more about his grappling with the crisis of his own inner desire to flee what is required of him. We have seen how the disciples all up until this point, what do? When the moment requires them to stay grounded and stay present and stay watchful and stay awake, they flee. This is Jesus' moment of grappling with wanting to flee. So that's part of it. It's more symbolic, but it's also, you have to remember back to the parable of the tenants. And it's just, he wasn't sent to die. He was sent to live, that they would listen to him. But because of the evil that exists, they didn't listen. And they've been plotting to kill him the entire time. And finally, their plots are made real. So that's the difference. He's asking, hey, may this be taken from me. But we know that he is different than the disciples. He follows through. Jesus follows through with the path that he said from the beginning. 3 times he's repeated, this is the path I know I must take. So we have to be careful how we take that line and then apply it to God. Any other questions or comments? Those are a great start. Yeah, Horty?
In reading that, it's always felt to me, it comes from a feeling place more than a thinking place, when he says, may this be taken from me. To me, that's just always been the expression of the depth of his humanity. We all often ask for help, but he instantly returns to the depth of his nature. He immediately makes almost an about face and says, yeah, I'm human. I ask for that, and thy will be done.
I'm going to say this part now because I feel like it'll help us a little bit more. I've been trying to dance around the discussion of this particular topic, wanting to read it first and then get to it. But I feel like because this is challenging to us, this episode is extremely similar and very consistent with the Homeric style of hero's journey. And if you go back at some point and read the Iliad, what you'll have is these moments when the hero is faced with this inner monologue of doubt, exactly what Jesus is going through, and this deep humanity where the hero within Homer is wavering between following the desires of his heart or her heart, but mostly his, in following the ways of wanting to preserve and the ways of fear. And then all of a sudden within the Homer epics, you'll see this shifting, this pulling yourself together, and often with some type of formulaic line. And in this case, it's, but not my will, your will. Then the hero proceeds to do the right thing. In a lot of ways, this episode represents Jesus' own hero's journey. Okay, so there's something formulaic in the way that it happens. But more than that, I agree with your assessment, Horty, that it is so human. It is so heart-led. And that is so powerful because we get to see that this is not just a robot doing what's required of him. He is making choices that follow the difficult path. And he's doing the same thing he's asking his followers to do, which is what last chapter was about. See, he's fulfilling, he's living into it. It's very important that he shows that how to do these things well, how to go through these times of trial well. And yeah, he's grappling with his inner demons there, but he comes out on the other side and proceeds to move to do the right thing. And that to me is just the quintessential Homeric style hero's journey. Okay.
I'm sure it sounds a little weird, but I've often found this particular passage really encouraging because of that.
It's intended to be. Yeah, it's intended to be. And see, that's what, as an audience, we can react to it on that level. But when you read it this time, look and see how, all right, he's not just talking, he's not just talking to us, he's talking to the disciples, or he's doing this for the sake of the disciples in the story, and how are they reacting? And then that's a totally different thing. And so we get to see, react to Jesus as he's speaking to us, but then we also get to react to the disciples as they react to Jesus. And it helps us kind of get greater clarity in what our right thing is. Bob?
This reminds me of what Martin Luther King was going through. He was saying that I may not be with you when we get to the promised land.
Well, that portion, but then he had that famous story after he had gotten so many death threats and his family was threatened, and he sat there and he wasn't sure he could do it. I think he was talking to his wife about that, and he wrote about this, that moment where he just said, I don't think I can do this. And then somehow, again, this is him, but he wasn't following like a script or a formula here, but it really does embody that same hero's journey there. He was grappling, and then he ended up deciding to follow through with the path, knowing that, his life was in danger. So I think that's a really good example, Bob, because in that way, he might have very humanly also asked that he did. He asked that it be removed from him. And in the end, he realized that's just, that can't, then it stops. If that's how it happened, then the evil wins. Because he's preserved himself. Only when we give our lives, only when we dare to risk losing our lives will we save them. This is what he's embodying. He's showing us how to do it. And King and others did the same thing. All right, good stuff. We could talk about this I know we could probably just have a conversation like this the whole time. We'll continue the conversation after we do some reading. I did include the outline of 14, 1 to 52 in the notes, so just know that. And what I'd like is 4 volunteers to read the sections of today's reading. If I could see, get 4 volunteers. Marilyn, Bonnie, Jay, and Barbara. Okay, thank you. Here we go. All right, so we'll read the first two sections. So that's the plot to kill Jesus and the anointing at Bethany. Each person's going to read two sections.
Okay,
So Marilyn, would you please start?
sure. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." The anointing at Bethany. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the anointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way?" For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor. And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her."
Beautiful. Bonnie, would you please read the next two sections? Bonnie, did you hear me?
I'm sorry, I was still on
Okay.
mute. Sorry. I'll start again.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray him. Passover with the disciples. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asked, where is my guest room where I may eat Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he came with the 12. And when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They began to be distressed and to say to him one after another, "Surely not I." He said to them, "It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born."
Thank you, Bonnie. Jay, would you read the next two sections, please?
The institution of the Lord's Supper. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and he said, "Take, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I tell you, I will never give drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new from the kingdom of God." Peter's denial foretold. When they had sung the hymn, he went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised, I will go before you in Galilee." Peter said to him, even though all become deserters, I will not. Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said vehemently, even though I must die with you, I will not deny you. And all of them said to the same.
Thank you. And lastly, Barbara, would you please read the next 2 sections?
Jesus prays in Gethsemane. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake. And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a 3rd time and said to them, Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough, the hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. The betrayal and arrest of Jesus. Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. So when he came, he went up to him at once and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. Then they laid hands on him and arrested him. But one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to them, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. All of them deserted him and fled. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked.
Ooh, thank you. I don't know about you. I always get a chill when that scene happens. It's just so intense. The prayer scene in Gethsemane is so it just grabs me, and I feel that intensity of love for and compassion for what Jesus is going through. Just it's so deeply human, and to have him do that ritualized 3 times, going back, and then he finally says enough. It's like it's finally done. It's written. It's complete. There's no chance for them to stay awake now anymore. And it's just like, it's just so intense, so intense. Okay, let's get into this. We'll cover a lot of bases here, but I want to start with the scene of the woman. And I already mentioned that she is the last representation of good soil in the gospel. But I wonder if you can tell me, what are the elements of what she does and how she does it that reflect Mark's definition of good soil? How does she represent good soil? What are the specific ways? Carol?
She gets it from the very beginning. The disciples, then they're on her case, and it's like, you've heard this how many times before?
Yes.
And you don't get it. She comes here and she's already gotten it, and she's
Yeah.
willing to do what she needs to do.
Exactly right. Where the disciples have not listened. And what's been the instruction since the transfiguration? This is my beloved son. Listen to him. This woman clearly has listened because she's anointing him. She's anointing him with love, but for burial. She recognizes that what he said is true. She's responding to his words. She's acting because she listened. Exactly what Carol said. And whereas the disciples, they haven't listened. It hasn't sunk in still. And so they refuse to listen. And it's just this powerful, distinction here that's being played off. Again, it's creating so much tension through this whole chapter, and it's just brilliant. Now, there's some other things, though. What are some other ways that her story embodies the good soil? One is interesting. Does she have a name? No. One of the characteristics of good soil is not calling attention to yourself, anonymity. And when Jesus says she will be remembered for all time, he's right, but not because of who she is, but because of what she did. That's what good soil does. Not about claiming personal glory, but about acting in faith and serving one another. I mean, that posture that she takes is the most servant-like position. It's just capturing some of that element there. Okay. Tell me one other way, if you can spot it. Barbara?
Well, she uses that very costly nard. It is nothing is too good for Jesus.
Exactly.
Nothing is too expensive for Jesus.
And that's beautiful. Good. Just like the Sabbath is made for humans and not humans made for the law, money is made for continuing blessing and love in the world, not for being slaves to it. So the fact that she takes this expensive nard, just like Barbara said, nothing's too good because it's given in love. And therein is the rub. So when you look at those verses between 4 and 11 there, notice how money is used. 4 and 11. So the woman's story is up through verse 9 and how she uses the expensive nard. And then right after that, Judas makes his plot. And notice this. Do they ever mention how much money they're going to give him? No, they just say some money, okay? The point is, it doesn't really matter how much, but how does Judas utilize money? How did the disciples consider money versus the woman? Barbara already mentioned that the woman utilizes her expensive ointment for the sake of love. How does that contrast with the way the disciples treat money? Go ahead, Barbara.
Well, I think it says, number one, they have a judgment with the money. The money is supposed to be used for the poor. So they're grabbing it, and then they're going to decide who's worthy to get it.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. So that kind of puts them in a command position rather than a compassion position.
Right.
And it sort of reflects something we've seen through the gospel. And that is when they talk about money, it has to do with the value of money and what they can get and how much it is and sort of enriching themselves when it comes to money. They've been concerned about glory. They've been concerned about position, power, control. Hey, that person, we should smite that person. They're not part of our group. This is what they've embodied. So their attitude toward money is off. Okay, they're missing it. So they treat money as if it's got a value in and of itself. We can get all this money. Let's sell that. We can get all this money. And then we can decide to give it to the poor. Exactly. Mark is saying that the way money is utilized is more, the best utilized in the kingdom of God is more in alignment with the way this woman uses it and not the way the disciples are treating it. And that's all. Just reflect on that because there's a lot there. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Yes, and she also is really demonstrating generosity. And I know that this goes along with some of the other things we've said, but we have no indication that she is a wealthy woman.
Exactly.
And she's just being so generous to honor this man whom she thinks so highly of.
Yes, she's being so generous because she's listened and because she's faithful. She's responding out of that natural generosity. See, that generosity is part of the fruit. That is the bearing of the fruit. Look at how it works. It's like the giving tree, you know, that sort of thing. So that itself, her act there is the embodiment of fruitfulness, that generosity that just kind of comes out. You can't even, there's nothing you could say. No one had to tell her to do that. It just came from within. Powerful illustration of how money is intended to be used to bless, to serve, humanity and to serve the world. And again, the disciples, we can look at it and say, well, they weren't bad, but the way Mark's presenting them is that I think what Barbara said is true. They wanted to control. They wanted money to be able to come in and say, all right, we get this much and then we can just allocate it. That's not what Jesus is talking about, or that's not what Mark is talking about here in terms of how money is best utilized. And then when Judas wants to do it, participate in the betrayal and the plot, and he gets money to do that, it's again pitting these two distinct ways of viewing money with each other. It's very powerful. I think I saw another hand down here, or down on my lower corner, but maybe not. It might have been a scratching of a cheek. Okay. Boyce.
It seems like she was just so immediate and so assertive with her behavior. Here they are eating dinner, and she just comes in and barges in and doesn't even say, hey, do you mind if I put a little of this on his head? And
Yes.
runs over and just takes this whole bottle. It's not even just dribbling on or dabbing it on like I think a person would put perfume on. She just empties the whole jar on his head.
Excellent noticing too. Another illustration of what good soil looks like. Go back and consider the other illustrations we've seen. The most recent one would be blind Bartimaeus. He called out assertively, Jesus, son of David. The disciples tried to shush him. He called out all the more. He would not be held back. She is not held back either. She just responds out of this generosity. It's powerful. And she didn't need to be told. She didn't just dab it a little bit and hold back for herself. No, she just gave it. It was just this natural gift, powerful illustration of not only how money and riches or items like that are to be used, but really just what the spirit of generosity and the fruitfulness of faith can look like.
It almost seems comical to me to see Jesus sitting there with this bucket of stuff flowing over his head, down his long hair and everything.
That might be how Monty Python presents it, but exactly. To me, it's just this effusive giving, and maybe that would be a wonderful way to show it. Just this bucket of nard just being dumped on him to illustrate the wantonness of it. But it illustrates her generosity for sure, and the love with which she shares it. And then in that moment, Jesus says something very interesting, very of note that we have talked about for a long time in the church. And I wonder if you can tell me what you think he means when he says that. And the point I'm talking about is that section, what is it? 6-9, verses 6-9, where he says, hey, the poor are always going to be with you. You can do that all the time, but I won't be with you. So don't get in her face, leave her alone. Let her do this. This is generosity at work. What's he talking about there? What does he mean when he said that stuff? Is he basically saying, hey, poverty's always going to be with us? You can't sort of give enough to get rid of poverty. So, don't worry about the poor. Is that what he's saying? No. No, he's not saying that. And he's also not saying, so don't worry about helping the ones in need. No, he's not saying that either. He's talking about how in addressing the bigger picture of need in our midst, in our communities, it requires that view of helping on a broad scale and helping the poor in a general, larger sense, but it also requires these specific acts of deep generosity to individuals. Another powerful reflection point in our modern world where it's increasingly difficult to kind of reach out on personal levels to help those in need. And the best way many of us as churches react to need is we give on broader scales. We give money and we send it out to where it goes. And it's helpful, but it's one path. It's one path. And what Jesus is talking about here is that this other path of that individual, personal generosity, that compassion, that is critical too. So what she's doing is a beautiful part of enacting the kingdom, of meeting poverty. That's one of the ways. Jane?
Just as you were saying this, it came to me that, we are always trying to think how we can participate in the greater good on big issues, on big things like homelessness or
right.
Food insecurity. But he's really shared with me was just helping a neighbor in need. Just if I see a need, and it's one act, one individual act that I can do today. Don't let that pass me by, that one act.
Yes.
Do that one act while still keeping the bigger picture in mind.
Stay alert, be watchful. Yeah. Those moments arise. And yes, other gospels have talked about it like that, but Mark is really expressing it in his own way. Mm-hmm. That's how we enact the kingdom. It's mm-hmm. a part of it. It's important because it cultivates a spirit of awareness, of mindfulness, of generosity. It cultivates it. Because if we just hold back, if we're just like, okay, I'm going to wait, I do my part, I do it, then we risk hardening ourselves. We sort of seal ourselves off. It's kind of what can happen. Doesn't always happen, but it can. Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. Marilyn. Microphone.
Something happened to me recently where I was the recipient of that kind of generosity, of helpfulness. So somebody rang my doorbell and I didn't expect anybody, and nobody just shows up at my house. But I went and opened it, put my mask on and went and opened it, and it was a neighbor, and she said, "Marilyn, have you had your vaccine?" And I said, "Well, actually, yes, I've had the first shot and I'm due for the second one at the end of next week." And she said, "Well, I've just heard about this place in Roseville and I made an appointment for myself." And she said, "I just wanted to be sure that you had it." And I mean, this is a neighbor I visit with when we are on our morning walk.
Yep.
It's not like we're really close, but I just felt wonderful from that all day long.
Beautiful. And you raised something that I would say most of us probably could benefit from greater cultivation. And that is not only cultivating our generosity of what we offer, but cultivating our spirit of generosity to receive, to be able to receive the generosity of others, because that's the only way generosity can function. It's always a two-way street. It's just like the only way discipleship can function is if seed meets good soil. It's a two-way street. And so generosity, as we cultivate it, is not just about what we might do, what we might offer, but it's about being ready and watchful to receive the love and the generosity and the spirit of others around us. It is such a powerful teaching because I would venture that most of us struggle with receiving more than with giving. And I think it partly comes from when we give, we are more in control. We get to be aware a little bit more of what's happening. When we receive, it's like, whoa, it puts us in a different position, and oftentimes a vulnerable position, or we perceive it as vulnerable. But truly, what's the line? Your practice of generosity in receiving allows the joy and the blessing of the giver to be fully realized. Horty?
I was aware in my hospice work that even when times are full of need, it was often difficult for people to receive actions from their family or their neighbors, or, I've always been the big, strong, whatever, I don't need that. And I would often say to people, you know how good you feel when you do something for someone? Please let that other person feel that good by giving to you.
Yeah.
And it sometimes made that barrier just a little softer.
Yep. I like that analogy. And because that is what it does. It softens the soil, because otherwise it's the hardness, right? It can create more hardness. And again, it's not a judgment of people. It happens. We go through our whole lives, sometimes not having the tools or the esteem or just the practice of receiving as much as we give. And it's necessary for it to be a two-way street. And sometimes it takes these end of life moments to really open us to what that means finally. But it's just this in its own way. This little story is conveying that message of this is what generosity is. And look at how gracefully Jesus receives it, as opposed to the disciples receiving it or not receiving it. So it really, again, I'm going to say this multiple times. This chapter bears almost like going back and just chewing on each of these moments and reflecting on them, because they all have these like connectors to our own faith lives, our own faith journey. And that's the power and the endurance of this gospel, is that it meets us where we are and we get it. We can get it on these levels that we've been talking. I want to move to the next section because we've still got a lot to cover, and it's 9:51, but it's all good. Everyone's okay staying till noon today. Just kidding. All right. So why does Judas betray Jesus? Jay?
I've always understood it as he's trying to force Jesus's hand. It's not, he didn't do it for the money particularly, but he's trying to force Jesus's hand to become the Messiah, or the charging in on a white horse and saving the Jewish nation.
Does Mark tell us that?
No, I think it's just in what I've been taught, what I've read, what I've learned, what I've seen. That's more the consensus that I've gotten over the years. You're
raising something that I do. And I mean, heck, if you saw, there's a lot of movies that that show this. But also if you saw what I did last year about the Judas, the once my name was common thing. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of speculation as to Judas' motivation, but that really is more about modern biblical scholarship and convention than, in this case, Mark, because Mark gives us nothing. We do not know what Judas' motivation is. Okay, just like we might assume it was only 30 pieces of silver or whatever, but at this point, it's just money. And that's the point. We want to make sure we get what the point that Mark's trying to tell us is. And in that case, he's not focusing on 30 pieces. He's focusing on money because how it, interacts with the money that we've just seen that woman use. Well, in this case, we're not given the motivation of his betrayal. But
well, in this case, does it matter what his motivation was?
Exactly. It doesn't matter. And that's what we need to see, is that Mark hasn't told us, so it doesn't matter. Mark didn't give us a birth story, so it doesn't matter to him.
Yeah.
Okay. We're not meant to say, well, it must have just been like Matthew said. No, don't do that. Let Mark tell the story. Mark wasn't writing in conjunction with anybody else. He was writing for himself, and his message is powerful in its own right. So we don't have a motivation, but what we do know is that betrayal Just like generosity is one of the signs of good soil, betrayal is one of the signs of hard-heartedness. This is what happens. He said from the beginning, not only that Judas would betray him, but that the Son of Man would be betrayed, because that's what rocky soil, that's what hard-heartedness does. So we don't know what the motivation is, but we know that this is what happens when hard-heartedness meets the message of Jesus.
So stop overlaying on the story.
Sorry?
Stop overlaying on the story.
We all do it. We all do it all the time. And the short answer is, please, yes, as best we can. But it's hard because we conflate this stuff all the time. And we don't remember, and then we think, and that's why the church added in that end, the extra bits to Mark 16. They added it in because it then coheres better with Matthew and Luke, but it's not at all what Mark originally wrote. Okay, so we all do, Jay. We all do this. It's just really hard. But anyway, it's just a good practice to say, oh, okay, I'm going to just try as best I can. So what is Mark trying to say here? If I just kind of take off, I put that on there, I put that layer on, I put that piece of, interpretive clothing on this story. Let me just strip it down naked and just really appreciate it for what Mark's trying to say. So we don't know, but we do know that it's brothers who will betray brothers. That's what Jesus has said. So we know that in that sense, Judas is playing into the type of the hard-hearted rocky soil. We can see that, okay? But we really don't know motivation. I just wanted to bring that up because it's something, again, we as modern Christians love speculating on Judas' motivation. And Judas, the character, is so rich and worthy of such speculation, but it's a different conversation, okay? Okay, so now we go to the Passover meal. And Jesus gives these very specific instructions. What do those instructions remind you of? Have you seen instructions this specific before? Go ahead, Horty.
Going and untying the colt, bringing him to the ride.
Almost exactly the same type of instructions as he gave them in Mark 11. Almost exactly. And then how does it play out? Everything happens exactly to the detail of what Jesus says. So what is this trying to illustrate for us? Jesus' credibility, Jesus' believability, his authority, that the things he says will happen. It's Mark's way of emphasizing not only to the people in the story, to the disciples, he's trying to emphasize that to the disciples, but who's he talking to here? He's talking to us. So that the stuff he says, it's sure to happen. So make sure you listen, because again, as we said last week, a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, this idea of resurrection, of finding new life through the trials, it's going to happen outside the scope of this narrative. It takes faith to act this way. So it's setting Jesus up as a credible authority, a believable prophet. The things he says happen. Okay, that's the context. And so we should obey what his requests or orders are. Any questions or comments about that? Marilyn, excuse me. Microphone.
He doesn't pray to God and say, we really need a place for our Passover meal. Find something for us. He's on his hero's journey. Yeah. And he's telling them very specifically and exactly all those details happen just like he says. And you know what's interesting too? It really picks up on some details. This isn't new. This is a convention, actually. If you go back and look, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 10, I think it is. Yeah, chapter 10. The story of Saul, who is Israel's first king, the story of him going to be told that he's going to become king is very similar to this. All these details that are made to happen, okay? It's sort of picking up on some of this type of stuff. But really, Mark's utilizing it to express Jesus, sort of authority and credibility as a prophet. What he says happens. So what he's telling us to do, we should do.
That's what Mark's setting up. So then when Jesus does that, we've got these specific reactions from the disciples, particularly in verse 19 and then in verse 31. Okay. In verse 19, they sort of, well, someone tell me, what's their reaction in verse 19? What's the reaction of the disciples there? Go ahead, Jane.
Oh, well, they say, not me, but is it me? I mean, they still.
They're asking the question. It's a legitimate.
Yeah.
Surely it's not me. Will it? Is
Yeah.
it? It's a
Yeah.
question. They're questioning
Yeah.
themselves. And so then
They
in
are.
31, what's their response? What do they say? How do they act?
I will never say that I don't know you. I will.
Exactly.
even
I would never
with
say
you.
that. So what do those reactions communicate about the disciples? I would never betray you. That's basically
But they're doubting when they say, but would I? But then they do ask the question.
Yes.
So they're all in their own minds. They're really vacillating and they're wishy-washy, and they
Yes.
and they don't stand truly behind him. They don't have his back. They don't stick with him. They're not.
Yes.
They're
Yes.
not there
Yes.
for him.
Love that.
These are his best friends. It's like, how heartbreaking. His best friends.
If it wasn't so heartbreaking, it would be hilarious because it's so ridiculous. But you're absolutely right. And I hope you all notice this. Go back and read it if you didn't. But when they speak like this, they literally are like at first, well, Jesus, could it be me? I don't know. Surely it's not. And then they go back and then they're so boastful that it won't be them. And it's like a transparency. It puts it out there that, this is what they do. They're not, how can they say with such conviction that they won't desert him when they're not even sure if they're not the one to betray him? It just undercuts the credibility, okay? Their first response undercuts the credibility of their second. And just like Jane says, they are the ones that have always vacillated. They're the ones that have always kind of just said one thing and done another, or that, so it's just another powerful illustration of their nature at this point, and that is the rocky soil, that they don't get it, and they just represent this kind of call it boastfulness, this assertiveness that cannot be backed up by how they act. Any other comments about that, Bob?
Isn't Jesus quoted as saying the spirit is strong, but the flesh is weak?
Oh yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. And that's true. And that is sort of a summary of what the rocky soil is. Okay. That's what rocky soil is. Starts off great, enthusiastic, eager. And then kind of when persecution and trials happen, things get tough, it withers and flees or dies. Okay. But we'll get to that because that's coming up. Okay. The bread. We're going to talk about bread and cup. Oh, Bertie.
I think this portion is another example of Judas's hardening of his heart, because Jesus says it would be better for the betrayer not to have been born, and you would think that maybe I ought to rethink what I'm going to do,
Yes.
But nothing like that. He just goes about his business like he's planned.
And what's really cool that you brought up Judas here, Bertie, and everyone noticed this too. Judas is brought up and singled out. Peter is brought up and singled out. But almost in every instance, all the disciples are kind of brought into cahoots. All of them are brought in to be like this. So Peter might be the one that says, I won't leave you. And then it says, and they all said the same. It's kind of Mark saying, yes, he's using individual examples. And we often single out Judas, but all of them in their own way are betrayers, are deserters, are deniers. Okay, so that's the powerful connection there. He uses them individually to communicate certain aspects of the message, but let's be careful. We're not putting this on Judas. This is something that all embody within the disciples. And then we can also talk about on a different level how all of us reflect those qualities. Okay, so let's not make Judas the scapegoat here. Okay, but truly, it's stark. And as Bertie said, the way it's written, you're almost like, well, geez, can't they, what, if that's what he's saying, then maybe they should be reflecting on this and think about, maybe we should react a different way, but they just can't see it. The bread thing though. So we got the meal and we got the bread, and when Jesus breaks the bread and gives it to him, okay, what are some of the themes that are brought together by this sharing of bread based on some of the themes we've seen already in the gospel? What's some of the major themes that come up when you talk about bread and the sharing of bread? Bonnie, and then Boyce.
Well, the first thing that popped in my mind, and I don't know if this is where you're going, but were the two feedings of the 5,000 and then the 4,000, where he's, that's what they're doing. They're sharing bread. And at that point, they even had leftover bread.
Yes. And that's the bread of faith right there, the sharing of the bread, where they took the bread and they gave it and everyone received, and it was wonderful because it was multiplied and it was abundant. It was enough. But the disciples, did they understand about the bread in those two feedings? Jesus uses those exact words because, or that Mark uses those exact words. They didn't understand about the bread. So that is what it calls to mind, those two feeding stories. Boyce, did you, but the disciples didn't get it. Okay, they didn't get it then. Will they get it now? Boyce, did you have something you wanted to add? Was it the same thing? Okay. It also calls to mind the Moses story of feeding them in the wilderness with the manna. I mean, all these things connect. But the point that Mark's trying to make here is that when Jesus breaks the bread and gives it to the disciples this time, it's an open question that we see as an audience. It's like, oh my, we've seen how they didn't understand about the bread before. Will they understand it this time? When he says take, will they really take? Because is it the literal taking of the piece of bread, or is it the metaphorical taking of the whole message, the bread that is life, the bread that is the seed? That's up for debate. And based on what the disciples have done so far, doesn't look so good. Doesn't look so good that they're going to be able to get this. Okay. Bonnie?
And then he says, the one that is going to betray me is the one that is dipping the bread. And I get the picture that, I don't know if they had, olive oil or what they were dipping it in, but it's like, I get the picture that Christ and Judas were both dipping at the same time. And I don't know if that's what he means, but that's sort of the picture I got. And you think you would be sure and say, well, I'm not going to put my bread in dip when he does, because that'll give it away. But apparently he went right on and did it, and nobody paid any attention.
Well, actually, this is the institution not only of the Last Supper and the communion, but it's the institution of fondue parties. So this is what, whether it's cheese or chocolate. But actually, to me, the whole dipping in the bowl thing is an expression of intimacy, of shared meal. To dip in someone else's bowl is something you only do when you're with them, when you're really with them. When you're eating in a cafeteria, you're not eating that way. But when you're eating with family, that happens. That's to me what that's communicating. Someone who's dipping in my bowl, is going to betray me. It just plays on that pathos of this whole moment. It's just ratcheting up the tension and just how tragic this is, and he's playing off on it. It's just like, again, this building of tension. And to me, the bread part is second in terms of intensity to the cup part. And here's why. Well, I'll ask you. So what is ironic about the sharing of the cup? What is ironic about it? And when I ask that, I want you to think back, if possible, to another time when Jesus mentions sharing a cup. Do you remember that? Do you remember? And this is what Mark wants us to remember, this whole sharing a cup. Do you remember what the previous reference about Jesus asking a couple of his disciples if they could share the cup? When it's that whole time when they basically, I think it's James and John, and they approach him, and in this story, I forget what chapter it is, it's before, and they ask him, so which one of us is going to be on which side of you in glory? Remember that whole thing? And then he's like, you guys have no idea what you're asking me. Do you think you can drink the cup that I drink? Okay, we know what he's talking about there. Disciples, no clue. So this story shows them sharing a cup, shows them sharing a literal cup at dinner. Is that the cup that Jesus was referring to? Not at all. Not at all. We see what the real cup that Jesus was referring to is when he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and prays that powerful, fateful line, take this cup from me, God, but immediately, but not my will, your will. That's the cup. And we see then that the disciples are incapable of taking that cup with Jesus. Why? Because they can't even stay awake. They can't take the metaphorical cup. That's the irony of the cup. The disciples are like, well, they might have thought that, oh, well, we got to drink the cup with him, so we can drink the cup with you, God, yay. But this never was the cup that Jesus was referring to. See how powerful those images play off one another? When they shared that cup in the meal, and then he goes out, and then there's the real opportunity to share the cup of the journey of faith. And the disciples they prove unable to drink from that cup. It's just, again, a beautiful rendering through narrative, through the building of tension, that Mark just communicates such profound humanity through these stories that maybe you noticed, but it's okay if you don't notice it here in your head. I feel that when we read these stories, they sort of sink in here, and we may be being impacted by this stuff beyond our ability to articulate it. So I think that you've been responding to some of this stuff, maybe your whole lives, but maybe this time in particular that we've been reading it, that it's really pushing these buttons within us and creating these responses that lead us to such clarity as far as like, no, and reacting to the disciples, and yes, oh my gosh, how beautiful. And, all these things that we feel and the motivations that we have and what's happening within us, all that stuff. Mark is crafting a story to evoke that, to shape that within us. So awesome. Can't say that enough. Comments about that, about the cup and the bread, anything else there? Bonnie?
Do you think that they got it at all? I mean, we every month we celebrate isn't the right word, but we honor communion. We replicate this, and Christian churches do that as this being such an important event. And you almost get the impression that they just thought it was bread. And well, what kind of wine was that? And, was this bread fresh this morning, or was it made yesterday? I mean, did they even get it, that the whole symbolism of the bread and the wine, or I don't know if it even says wine, but, whatever it was they were drinking?
What do you think?
I mean, now I'm getting the impression they just missed the whole point, missed it completely. I don't know.
Bree, I think they do know what it means.
Who's they?
The multitude, the congregants.
Okay, I will say this, Annie, you're on to something here. I will tell you this. It doesn't matter to Mark if the disciples in the story ever get it, because he shows us that they don't. The concern of Mark is whether or not we get it. The multitudes, as Anne says, because that's who the multitudes are. When Jesus talks about giving his cup and pouring it out for many, we're part of the many. So it almost doesn't matter if anyone in the story gets it. Do you get it? And then what does it mean? And then what does it mean? And we could go into all sorts of conversations like C.K. Chesterton did and say, look, Christianity is one of the greatest ideas that's never been tried because it's been an exercise of missing the point from the get-go, or at least from the time of Constantine. I would agree with that in large measure, in general. I would agree with that. But somehow through the institution of religion that started in the 4th century, we've at least maintained a thread to these messages that we can still parse out and see. So I'm thankful for that. But I think ultimately, if we think the purpose of communion is to taste the bread and to drink the cup and blah, 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 and it's just ritualized and it means nothing in terms of our lives and how we live it, if it takes us completely out of what Mark is trying to ask us to do, then we have missed it.
Yes.
And I mean, we as a general, you know, and this is where each one of us has to make that choice. And that's the beauty of Mark, isn't it? Mark is saying it comes down to that. We make the choice. So to say, you know, do they get it? Does it matter if they get it? Do you get it?
Yeah.
I want you to go back and look at verses 27 to 31. This is an incredible interchange between Jesus and Peter. And again, if it wasn't so tragic, it'd be comical. But there's a lot of irony here. So Jesus is having this conversation with all the disciples, but primarily with Peter in this instance, 27 to 31. And, you know, he's basically saying, you know, you guys are going to be deserters. You're going to betray me, blah, 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 all that stuff. And Peter reacts to that. But what is ironic about his reaction? What's ironic about that interchange?
He truly believes that he won't.
And the more stridently he asserts that he won't, the more we know that he is.
Yeah.
Everything he's saying there, I won't. All he's doing in contradicting Jesus is denying him twice right there.
Yeah. Yes.
That's what Peter has just done. It's just, again, we see that as the audience because we have that perspective. But like Anne said, from Peter's perspective, he's thinking, well, I won't. Blah, blah, blah. And they all say the same, but we see it for what it is. Okay. And because they get so caught up in their strident contradiction of Jesus there, what's the one critical piece of information that they seem to miss? They just skip right over it and they don't even address it. And it's in verse 28. This is pretty critical information. And they skip right over it because they can't see it. They can't hear it. It's so wonderfully done. I think you know it. If you read that verse, you know what I'm talking about. Where he says, after I'm raised, I'm going to meet you in Galilee. That's pretty pertinent information. But it's also information, like I've been saying, that's something that will be resolved, that will be fulfilled outside the bounds of this story, outside of this narrative. To be able to hear that or receive it requires faith, requires you to be good soil. They can't hear it. They don't even address it. They missed it. Okay? But we don't. As the audience, we hear it. We see, okay, I hear you, Jesus. I get you. We'll see how it is by the end. You know, what are we going to do? How will we respond? But we see what he's getting at. Horty?
I was just struck once again by the specificity of I'll meet you in Galilee, because several times he said, go get the colt and follow the guy with the jar of water. He's very specific.
Yes.
And this is another time they're just not listening to the specificity of what he's indicating.
Yes. And then Galilee, as we've said before, Galilee is important because it not only represents a Gentile area, but it is literally the crossroads of all the trade routes in that region. It is the quintessential Gentile area where the Sea of Galilee is, okay? So it's just another illustration that this message, this gospel is not just for Jews, not just for the chief priests and it's not for all the people who think it's for them. No, it's for everybody. This is for all. So it's that I'm going to meet you in Galilee, but they miss that. We don't miss it though, as an audience. We don't miss it, or at least we have the chance to not miss it. Okay, next thing, another awesome interchange here. And I hope well, I don't know, maybe you did. I wonder if you noticed this. Verses 37 and 38, okay? Jesus calls Peter Simon. It's the first time and the only time he's called him Simon since chapter 3, when he named him Peter, the rock. It's the first and only time since that renaming time, which was when? What was that renaming time? What happened right in that renaming time in chapter 3? Does anyone remember? It's when Peter was called. It's when he, with the other disciples, were called. Okay, it's the call story. So what is the significance of sort of resurrecting this old name of Peter, this Simon name? What is the significance? And if you don't know, if you're not sure, don't worry, we're going to get there. But what are your thoughts? What could be the meaning of that? Because I assure you there is. I'll go with Meryl. I see Marilyn and then Horty.
Peter is not behaving like a rock.
When?
When he's when he's sleeping and he's supposed to be awake and watching out for Jesus.
Well, that's where the expression "sleep like a rock" came from. So,
oh.
Okay.
No, that's not the meaning of rock that renaming him Peter meant.
Well, I would contend that calling him rock is the reference to rocky soil that he was to become. But when he was called Simon, harkens back to a different time, a different possibility for him.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah, okay. So say more then. What?
Well, doesn't he say that he's going to rename him Peter, that he will be the rock on which the church, not the church, but I mean, I don't remember the exact wording. But the idea was that he's going to be a strength there. And so he's renaming him Peter.
Well, we assume the church has assumed that that's what calling him rock means. But through Mark's gospel, the rock has not been a positive designation. It has represented his rockiness of soil and all the disciples, and his rockiness of hard-heartedness. So it's a nickname that is peculiar. And the way Mark uses it is a little different than that more positive church spin that happens later. And I agree. It's like, that's why we have these St. Peter's Basilica, right? Because clearly that's what he meant. I don't think that's what Mark was referring to in renaming him Peter, or at least there's multiple layers here. I saw Horty first, and then I see Boyce.
I just wondered if in calling him in Simon, he was going back to the potential of who he was before he became even more rocky. He was going back to why I called you. I called you as Simon. There was something Simonness that I think could flower differently.
Beautiful. I think that's exactly what this is doing. It's that sense of calling him back to who he used to be. That time when he responded with eagerness and he started to bear fruit and he could see it. And when Jesus experienced his inner conflict, how did Jesus resolve it? Through prayer. And Peter's been invited to prayer, but never has really engaged it. And maybe if prayer could, or something could help him resolve his conflict, he's still capable of being good soil. It's almost this opportunity yet again to try to call out that one who did embody some good qualities, but because he's rocky, just it didn't have the fortitude to stick it out. But it's like calling him back to that previous name, that remember who you used to be, Peter. It's such a beautiful, like, oh, and yet then he says, and yet I understand the flesh is, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's Peter in a nutshell. But that's rocky soil in a nutshell. That's what rocky soil is. And look, a lot of us are that too. We know what that is. Spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's Peter. That's all the rocky soil. And we see it. You know, that's why he does 3 times. It's like this ritualized 3 times. He falls asleep, and he and the other disciples, 3 times he falls asleep. Oh, and by the way, 3 times he denies him. See, this is a way of emphasizing Peter had potential, but because the rockiness, the hard-heartedness within him, he couldn't stay awake. He couldn't stay watchful. He wasn't able to resolve the fear, the conflict within himself in the context of Mark. But again, Mark is less concerned about Peter and more concerned about you. Boyce and Ken, or Boyce, did you still have something you wanted to say? I can't hear you because your microphone.
Mine was very similar. Pre Peter the Rock was Simon the follower.
Yes. Excellent. Ken?
It's the repeat of what happened just earlier with the transfiguration. It's the same 3 disciples
Yes.
that are with Jesus up there on the hillside.
Exactly. And just like in that moment, you know, Peter represents this again, exercise in missing the point. He's just not able to see it. But again, he's helping us as an audience to see with clarity. So he has a role to play as a character. You know, all the disciples do. Let's not lose sight of that. They're not just forsaken. In fact, this story represents, even to the last, Jesus is almost extending this sense of possibility, of recalling. You know, because soil can change. We've seen that happen. Soil can change, you know, in the sense that fear can be overcome by faith. But it doesn't happen when someone's hard-heartedness creates the reactions that the disciples have embodied. That's what Mark's getting at. Was there another hand up? Peter.
Yeah, to me, what strikes me about this is forgiveness. Is that Jesus is looking at Peter, Simon, as not his actions, but his heart, his potential, his humanity. And so this is a great example of forgiveness that we read about here, that even we can be forgiven for being like Peter.
Beautiful. And that's exactly right. Jesus extends that forgiveness. But we also know that just like generosity, forgiveness needs to be received. And so there was still a role for Peter to play within that extension of forgiveness. And so it's this dynamic that's set up, but that continual offering that Jesus does throughout the gospel, we're going to see it again. We're going to see more examples of those who are on the so-called outside, or who embody sort of the non-good soil. They will still have these moments of insight and opportunity. The gospel won't necessarily tell us if it will reach fulfillment or faith. But the one example I'm thinking of is the centurion at the end when Jesus dies and he looks at him and says, truly, this man was the Son of God. That is a statement of faith. Now, Mark doesn't follow it through, so I wouldn't say that that centurion exemplifies good soil, but it's potential. It's that opportunity for us to leave that place of hardness, to leave that place of the type that we've always played, and be something that has the potential to bear fruit. That is such an important part. So this extension of forgiveness, and then the reception of forgiveness or not. It's a relationship there. Good stuff, friends. Horty?
I remember as a teenager maybe hearing in a sermon from someone that the hardest part of apologizing is really believing you'll be forgiven. And when Peter talks about, right, our Peter talks about forgiveness, then our doubts arise that we're even worthy of that forgiveness, which can then perpetuate the cycle in which we act out of our fear.
Yes. I think I think it's the Gospel of John that really pays attention to just that thing that you said in that, but Peter brought up, in that way of resolving Peter's conflict at the end of John. So Peter has, in John's version, has gone through the denials. We've seen the shame that he's brought on himself. But then in the ascension, or once Jesus reappears in the resurrection, Peter has this encounter with Jesus. And we've known that Peter denied him 3 times. Well, then 3 times Jesus says, feed my sheep. And when he does that, he's reclaiming Peter's role and inviting him into that space of shared walk once again. That is so powerful, because that is exactly addressing what you're just saying. Now, it doesn't say, we don't know, we don't get the inner workings of Peter as to whether or not he feels the self-worth to accept that, but we see the addressing of that tension. And we know that that's what it takes in order to make forgiveness real. We need to really receive it, to see that we are worthy of it, and then willing to take the steps to live it. Mark doesn't give us those details. And in fact, John doesn't either, for that matter. The Gospels don't tend to, because it's not about the characters so much in the story resolving their conflicts. It's about us seeing ourselves in all of it. And then here you go. What are you going to do? That's the key. That's the gospel. That's what Gospels are trying to do. Pull us on this incredibly awesome adventure of a roller coaster ride, and then send us to this place of, all right, will the adventure continue in you? How? That sort of thing. It's a powerful invitation. All right, last couple things. What's the symbolism of being betrayed by a kiss? This isn't like a trick question or anything, but just wanted to address that. Why a kiss?
Oh, kiss of death.
Well, I don't know if that's where that came from. Maybe that expression might have come from that, from this. But it's simply, all along, the relationship of Jesus to the disciples has been one of family, of brothers, of real care. It's a circle of friends here. And so a kiss is a reflection of intimacy, of friendship, of love. Yet all along, while the disciples have had that advantage of a relationship with Jesus, they have missed a complete appreciation and understanding of what that really means. And so this warping of a kiss for the sake of betrayal is just a powerful and almost perfect representation of the relationship that Jesus and the disciples have actually had. Okay. where you think they're supposed to be all connected and simpatico and loving and family. But no, it's actually the brothers that betray the brother, or the brother that betrays the other brother. It's the family that betrays this other family member. And so it just is like a little, a twisting of the knife, of the metaphorical knife there. But it makes it that much more impactful. That's what hard-heartedness and fear do. Go ahead, Ann. Were you going to say something, Ann?
I just said it sends its message.
It does. It makes it land so powerfully, and you kind of can't miss it. It's like, okay, yeah, it's just impactful to utilize that intimate expression in a perversion of the intimacy. And finally, for what I have to say today, we come to the naked young man. Okay. And look, I talked about the speculation of what he can mean. I think Mark is simply using him as an illustration of this is what hard-heartedness, the consequences of hard-heartedness are this. The consequences of rocky soil are this. Rocky soil leads to betrayal. Rocky soil leads to desertion. Rocky soil leads to denial. Okay. Judas is sort of the personification, not alone, but he's the personification of betrayal. This naked young man in this moment, sort of like, what is that? What is a manifestation of the rocky soil, the hard-heartedness of the disciples. And why is he singled out here? We don't see it yet, but again, he will return, and let us see how he returns. And notice some aspects of maybe how he's clothed when he returns, okay? Because he shed some clothing here, and then he's clothed differently when we see him again, okay? And it's the same Greek word, but anyway, so he will come back, but he is a manifestation of the fact that, well, the disciples as rocky soil deserted Jesus, and we saw that. They all ran when he was arrested. And then we will see that the other quality that Peter manifests is the quality of, or the consequence of denial. But we're going to see that next week. So we'll get to that. But those are the three qualities of hard-heartedness, of rocky soil: betrayal, desertion, denial. So that naked young man, I think, is a simple manifestation of that. That's basically what I wanted to share from all this material today. Is there anything else you want to say? Something that we didn't address? Just anything that you're feeling from all this right now? Any other reactions? Just it's a big chapter today, or section, because we didn't even cover the whole chapter. Daniel, you start, and then Jane and Bonnie.
The man loses his clothing and runs away naked. It's sort of like the disciples losing their, the concept of what they're supposed to be getting and deserting. I think there's some symbolism there of the guy losing his clothing and the disciples losing, their credibility or whatever it is.
You're on it. You're on it, because, and that's true, because look at the language. When Jesus says, enough, time's up, there's a finality to it. That Greek word can also, instead of being enough, it can be translated as it is paid in full. Okay, that's it. It's done. Okay, it's this sense of finality, and so the stripped down image, that the losing of your clothes, I think you're onto it. It reflects then that this is who they are. Okay, this is who they are. They are the ones that flee, and they're left to be nakedly seen as the ones who flee. Now, don't get too caught up in that, because we might see how this plays out. It might not be the end. Okay, again, Mark's going to be subtle about this, but I contend that when we see this young man again, it's a reflection on that extension of forgiveness, of possibility. But right now, that young man represents the fear that causes the disciples to flee. Jane, and then Bonnie. Microphone, Jane.
Okay, so it says that the priests and teachers sent people with clubs and swords when Judas approached Jesus. Were
Yeah.
they expecting a conflict? Were they expecting that the disciples would engage in some kind of conflict rather than letting Jesus be peacefully taken?
Mark plays on this less than other gospels, so I'll say that, because we don't have some of the give and take that happens here. But I think what that reflects is that they come to Jesus with their violence and their violent intentions and their might, and they want to apprehend him and contain him using that means of wielding power. And to me, his comment to them, he's like, you've seen me in the temple. Basically, he's illustrating to them, you've seen how I am. You know that that's not what I'm about, but you go ahead and you do your, it's just, they are fundamentally missing the nature of his power and the nature of his message, because they, for their part, are the worn path, the ones who are hard-hearted from the start. So they're just simply incapable. So in a sense, of course they come to him with clubs and swords and might, because that's the only thing they know. That's the only thing they value. And it's another way of Mark illustrating how the ways of the world, the ways of power, the ways of chief priests and all those in charge are just antithetical to the ways of Jesus, to the ways of faith, the ways of good soil. They just don't get it. So why not pick the most, stark, ridiculous means of arresting him, coming with all that stuff, which is completely unnecessary. But at the same time, that's what Mark's sort of like, of course they're going to do that. It's like, it's not really a big deal. Mark doesn't really spend too much time on it. Jesus reacts to it, and then it just allows us to see it as an audience. But we already know this. We know that they don't get it. We know that the ways of the world are different than the ways of Jesus. It's just one more illustration, one more indignity. Bonnie?
I'm feeling very ignorant, and I've studied Mark before, and I don't know how I missed this. I was always under the impression that it was Christ and the disciples and the soldiers, and somehow I missed that there was this whole crowd of people, because there's this man who ran off. Mark says someone cut off the ear of the soldier, which I don't know if other Gospels say that was Peter, or if we've just been sort of.
Well, no, and other Gospels, like I said, they do more with that, and then Jesus heals the ear, and it's a different focus. But Mark's not concerned about that. It's just a reflection of the use of violence and the fact that one of his followers, one of his disciples, unnamed as he is, but the fact that one of his disciples employs violence is another illustration of how they also miss it too. So the hardened path and the rocky path meet here, but they both miss the message. But we know that. We've seen how that works. So it's not surprising, but yeah, it's the chief priests, it's the scribes, it's all those ones who have been plotting since chapter 3 that they wanted to kill Jesus. And finally,
it's all of them plus the soldiers.
Yes, all of them.
And I don't know how I never knew that. But.
Well, because again, I think when we see it from different angles in different gospel renderings, it's easy to focus on different parts, or even to conflate or overlook. It's just what happens. It happens to all of us. So, Horty?
It just always seemed to me that the coming of them with violence like that, and as you say, trying to corral his power, is a reference back to the whole Davidic messianic expectation.
Yes. Yeah, because that's what power means to them. Power means, wielding strength and flexing muscle. And we've seen that, that's the way the world sees power. But that's not how Jesus exercises power. That has nothing to do with power in Jesus' world or in the kingdom of God. But the ways of the world, that's it. And that's been part of the tension. That's been what's at play. Those are the ways of fear, that type of power: violence, fear, hatred. The power that Jesus is embodying is the power of faith, forgiveness, self-sacrifice, generosity, service. You can name them all now because you've seen what that good soil looks like. You know, it's the power of reaching out beyond your fear. In fact, maybe take time to really just like think through the gospel and really name those qualities that really embody what faith is, and then just notice them. Notice what Mark has emphasized through this whole gospel: what faith is and what faith is not, what power is and what power is not, what love is and what love is not, what generosity is, what generosity is not. All these ways, because you'll be surprised at the clarity that comes through when this material is fresh, you know? So I would, you know, if you have time today, do that, you know, because Mark wants us to take away these things. Mark wants us to be clear because it matters. It matters what we decide. I always get a little sermon in there, a little preaching. Can't help it.
You didn't have to point it out.
You're right. I don't have to. But, oh, alas, I did. Okay, friends. Well, thank you for hanging in with me today for this intense, wonderful, rich class. So as you can see, I love this. I could probably keep going till noon. But Boyce, before we go, I see your hand up. So did you want to say something? Microphone.
There, that helps. I was talking to myself and then really enjoying it. This is way off subject. I had an event that happened to me in the last couple of days that elevated my human beingness to a higher level. And I just was wondering if anybody wanted to hear that.
Sure.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, it all started when I had to get something from the store, and I stopped at a Walmart and went in, and it was just a couple of things, so I didn't bother to get the wheeled cart. I just picked up a basket and was walking around. And by the time I got to the self-checkout stand, I could barely lift it up to the counter to place it there because I had purchased so many things. But I did check out, and I was looking around, and one of the employees looked at me and saw that I was kind of looking for something and asked if they could help. And I said, well, I'm looking for a cart. This is too heavy to carry out to my car. I'd parked quite a ways away. And so they said, well, there's some out the exit door out there. So I went out the exit door lugging this basket. And the guy out there who was ushering people around to the entrance door, which was down a ways, he didn't have any carts, didn't know where any were. So I walked down to the entrance door, went in, or put my stuff in a cart, went into the store to put the basket away, came out. And as I was wheeling the cart away, I heard a voice from behind me say, ma'am, what are you doing? And I said, I turned around and he looked rather flustered and didn't kind of stammered. And finally he said, do you have a receipt for that? He said, yes, I do. And he immediately went into the store. But I now can be called sir or ma'am. So I've been elevated to a different height into human beingness now. So I found that very enriching for my life.
And now we all have too. So thank you for sharing that. And we're going to use that as our close. I hope in your own ways, you all find a deepened and heightened sense of humanity through this work, through this week. And until we meet again, be well. And thank you for being here. Bye, everyone.
Amen.